Welcome to the Cross-Cultural Psych Podcast with Professor Paul Youngwin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here is Dr. Paul Youngwin Kim.
Today's guest is Dr. Helen Chung. Helen Chung, PhD, is Assistant Professor of Industrial Organizational Psychology at Seattle Pacific University in Seattle, Washington. She researches inclusive leadership, workplace diversity, storytelling in organizations, and subjective time. Helen is also founder and principal of Pathways Coaching and Consulting. In her non-working hours, Helen enjoys hiking PNW trails with her doodle and traveling with her family. Helen, welcome. It's good to have you here.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Thanks for being here. So my first couple of questions are about teaching. What classes do you currently teach, and which ones have diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging themes intentionally integrated into them?
Oh, okay. So I teach in the IO, Industrial Organizational Psychology Department at SPU, and we have master's and PhD students. So the courses that I teach are Intro to Organizational Behavior, Diversity and Globalization, Theoretical Perspectives on Organizations, and then this other class, which is sort of unique. This is what we might consider the faith integration class for our department. It's called Faith, Meaning, and Professional Foundations. And so you asked where I integrate with intentionality, diversity, equity, inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, of course, the diversity and globalization, because that is the topic, the focal interest of that class. And then I weave it into the others. So I would say that they're not necessarily, they don't take up a large portion of the class, but I always apply a DEI lens in some shape or, in some way, in the way that I teach, in the way that I run my activities, the kinds of sources that I curate for the students to interact with.
So you're highlighting both like a single class in your program that's focused on diversity, and then also how you weave all of the diversity components into all of the classes that you teach, right?
Absolutely.
Both the intentionally one class that's focused on multiculturalism or diversity or globalism, and then also being intentional about weaving that into all of your teaching load. So I really appreciate that perspective. I'm curious about faith-based perspectives. And you mentioned one class in particular, but really across your classes, do you have examples of how you do faith integration? And also, while you answer that, examples of DEI and belonging integration as well. And maybe because our listeners tend to be people interested in teaching, any teaching examples or exercises that you can highlight?
Okay. I have a couple examples in mind. So I'll target the DEI one first in terms of how do I facilitate a sense of inclusion and belonging in my classroom. And so in the Intro to OB class, the very first class, I actually provide a framework of cultural humility to my students. And I purposefully say cultural humility builds upon cultural competence. They're not exactly the same things. Cultural competence is more about the knowledge of different cultures, and cultural humility is about the posture that we hold in our interactions with people who are similar or different to us. And so once I give them that framework and have them reflect on it a little bit and ensure that we're all aligning on what cultural humility means and how, the behaviors that manifest, then we generate some norms that we want to abide by in our classroom community. So I have the students think at a very individual level, what's important to you? How do you want to show up? How do you want to be treated? And then I put them into small groups to talk about those ideas. They then transcribe those onto or put them onto the whiteboard. And we have then a large group discussion about the themes that emerged. And oftentimes I get all sorts of overlapping themes. So then we sort of reduce the redundancy. It's almost like coding
Right.
in a way.
Like a qualitative study, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's an inductive process that starts with the individual, then moves to the small group, then goes to the large group, and then we make some decisions. Of course, we have a discussion about, can we clarify what we mean by that word, or how does that actually show up in a behavior? Can we make it behavioral? And then we make decisions around what do we want to keep. And I do have a few non-negotiables, so that I say, here are kind of my norms and if you're all in agreement, can we build on this? And by the end of the class, we have a set of norms. And then the next class, I put that into a slide deck so that they see it again. And where appropriate, I will bring that language into our interactions when I notice that we're doing something.
Right.
And it's very interesting. It's a rather short activity. I mean, it takes us about an hour and a half. I guess that's not really short. My classes run 3 hours.
Right.
And there have been times when I've wondered, do I want to spend half of my introduction week on this activity? But I've done it several times, and it creates a baseline for how we want to show up and treat each other, and it carries through. So I continue to do it. So that's an example of creating inclusion and belonging, because what it gets students to do is to reflect on what's important to them, then to hear what's important to other people. There's resonance across students, and then, deciding what we will do going forward, and then committing to doing that. So because it's an inductive, collective activity, I think that in and of itself facilitates a sense of belonging. Everybody has a voice. Everybody, identifies what's important to them, and collectively we come to consensus. And
Helen,
so that's something that I do for belonging.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I was thinking, I love that because it, like you said, is a collective effort, right? And also, let me validate your sort of thinking about, do I want to spend this amount of time on the first day when you have many other things to cover on an exercise like this? And I was talking to another guest earlier this week, and he was saying how he's so intentional about the first 20 minutes of the quarter or the semester in a way that can set the tone for the rest of the time, right? And so being able to spend that first hour or so doing this kind of an exercise sounds like a really fruitful and an important thing. But I have a question, which is, I do something similar, which is asking students about ground rules that they would like to see throughout the quarter. How do you stop, or how do you protect against or prevent students just coming up with these very be nice to each other kind of rules, right? Or like don't offend each other kind of rules that don't go beyond that surface level, where maybe in some ways that type of a rule can be counter to creating that authentic learning environment, right? So be kind to each other or accept all opinions, right? How do you prevent that list from being dominated by those kinds of thoughts? Does that make sense?
Oh, yes. That's a great question. So before I do the exercise, I do lay out the boundaries of the class in terms of, here's why we're here. We're here to learn about this particular topic or a number of topics within organizational behavior. And we're also here to learn some skills. One of those skills is critical thinking. And I think that primes them to consider, okay, I'm not just here to read and then to hear the opinions of my peers. I'm actually here to examine our perspectives, my own and others, and not necessarily to evaluate the worthiness of the perspectives, but to weight them in terms of, okay, what are the benefits and perhaps even challenges of holding this particular perspective? Or given new information, might I alter my opinion or my perspective on a particular thing. And I think that initial framing primes students to think beyond, let's just be nice to each other.
Right, right,
Because that does not really advance deep learning.
right. So that initial set of instructions from you can really help students maybe to go deeper beyond just
Yes.
being kind to one another, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So in the FMP, in that class, that's the acronym for Faith, Meaning, and Professional Foundations. In that class, we are thinking about our values and how our values inform our professional demeanor, our interactions with one another, with potential clients, etc. And so the class is sort of created with the expectation that students are going to be introspective. And again, I do a lot of inductive activities in class. But one of the questions that I ask verbally in class and also have students write about in a paper form, short paper, is this question: what was the spiritual background of your childhood? However you would define that, and how does this inform who you are today? Now, I have grabbed that question from Krista Tippett, who is a podcaster, and she has a podcast called On Being, and that's one of her questions. It's kind of the starting point of her conversations with a variety of guests. What was the spiritual background of your childhood? And it's really important to add that part about however you would define that, because we have students from all backgrounds. Some of them come from Christian or other faith backgrounds, and some of them have no religious background per se, but there is a sense of spirit, right, of spirituality across students' lives, whatever their background is. And so I'm hoping that the question is open-ended enough to get them to think about, how do I think about myself in a world that is material, but also there's some transcendence. And so that is kind of a starting place for me in terms of getting students to open up to questions of spirituality, faith, and values, and how that shapes who we are and how we show up at work. And then another little example would be, we do look at some biblical texts, and one of the texts that we look at is the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I offer that text to them and I say, imagine yourself in the story. So I use the biblical text more as story or narrative. I say, imagine yourself in the story. Who do you most identify with and why? And then that moves us into reflecting on, what does it mean to get proximate to people who may need our help, people who are different from us. And we can sort of bridge into that conversation around helping, right? Helping people who are different from us. And that's something that is difficult. We know that from social psychology. And so I really I use that text to get students to think about this idea of what proximity actually means. And that can be psychological, it can be physical, it can be emotional. And the difficulty of getting proximate, but also the necessity of it, which I think really is apparent in that scripture. And if I can use the scripture so I don't use it in a dogmatic way, like I'm not trying to teach them this is what you should do, but more, here's what's playing out in the narrative. What do you think? Where are you in the story? And how might you respond if you were in a similar situation? And then students always say, well, it depends. It always depends on, because every scenario is going to be different. So I'm going to react a little bit differently. But I really I sort of get befuddled at that. It depends. I mean, we say it so much in psychology. IO psychologists are always saying, well, it depends. But sometimes that can be a little bit of a cop-out. And I don't know that Jesus would accept that. So that's another example of how I bring in moments of integration of faith and spirituality in the classroom.
I really like those examples. As you're sharing, I'm wondering, how do the students respond to those exercises? And I imagine even the term spiritual background of your childhood, even though you might say, define it however you want, that term spirituality can really make someone pause, right? And maybe they're not used to thinking about their lives in that way. So how do students respond? Do they respond well? Do they struggle? Do they grapple with it in a way that's really helpful?
Many of the students respond by describing the moral, religious, ethical values of their parents, and then how their parents tried to instill that in them, whether it was through church, synagogue, or some other religious institution. Some of them will explicitly say, oh, I didn't really have a religious background. So they distinguish sort of like, okay, I'm not religious, but maybe gets them to reflect about, was there any kind of spirituality in the family? So some of them do reflect on that. I've had a couple of students resist the question and feel that the question wasn't open-ended enough. And that has given me pause to consider what is a way to ask the question, or perhaps frame the question such that students are a little more expansive in their thinking. Because I agree with you. I think the word spiritual can sometimes be too specifying for some. Yeah, so I still think about that. I think about that a lot. And whereas I was thinking, oh, the question is so open-ended, you can answer it however you like. Didn't I say that? However you define it.
Right.
But one student gave me feedback and said, I felt really confined by the question.
Wow.
So if you had maybe framed it a little bit differently, or said explicitly, it's okay if you don't have a spiritual religious background. We all have a background in something. So you can elaborate on that. So I really appreciated that particular student's feedback to me.
Thanks for sharing that example of the feedback. And we're already talking about this, but from your experience, what are some of the rewards and challenges in teaching about DEI themes and belonging in a Christian higher education setting? And especially for you, Helen, given that you're teaching in a graduate program where many of the students are not looking for maybe the type of integration that sometimes undergraduate students are looking for, right? So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to that.
Sure, yes. So I think there is a personal reward for me in teaching at a Christian institution. And I think that is that I can authentically live out my own conviction that my Christian faith really animates what I do as a teacher, as a scholar, as a researcher. And I'm okay saying that, like to my students, like it's my faith that really animates what I do. And it is what gets me to care about issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And of course, you don't have to have a Christian faith to care about those things. But for me, it is very personal, and it is animated by my faith. So I feel authentic in the role that I have and what I do. There are challenges, though, as you have alluded to. One of them being that I need to teach to a whole gamut of students from different backgrounds. And I try to be invitational in the way that I raise questions around values, religion, spirituality. And I think using the framework of values is very helpful because we all know and can recognize that every human being has a set of values that we live by. Sometimes those values are implicit, or we may not actually make them articulate what they are in an explicit way, but the values are always in play. And I think students recognize that. So if I use that as the common sort of ground, and then we can go to some other places from there, like religious values, spiritual values, etc. And so I try to start from that common ground and then be invitational to have other kinds of conversations. And students, of course, always have choice in terms of if they, how deeply they want to get into a particular topic in class. In papers, when they're turning in deliverables, there's a little bit less choice because they have to interact with a prompt that I give them. And so there I also try to, like, as I was saying earlier, I try to give more open-ended kinds of questions when possible, but it's hard. It's hard to know the balance of being open and invitational and also pressing students to really think about a question in a way they haven't thought about it before. And it's a tension that I'm always kind of navigating.
Right.
Another challenge that I think I face a little bit in a Christian setting is that there's sometimes a tendency in Christian higher ed, of course it depends on the institution, but I think there's a tendency to want to elevate commonality and sameness over differences. And so at a foundational level, like faculty and staff at a Christian institution share a common faith, right? That is our common ground. But sometimes I think that I don't know what the motivation is, but sometimes I think that the underscoring of what is common makes some people reluctant to talk about differences. I see that phenomenon happen in the church quite a bit, and I think to some extent I have experienced it in my in my institution. More broadly speaking. Yeah. So that's a tension, and I think about that a lot in terms of, again, what is there even a balance to strike? Maybe that's not the right approach. But I feel that tension quite a bit. How much do I focus on differences, at the expense of celebrating what we hold in common? But then doing that also, there's an expense on the other side. Is this making sense?
Totally. And I think you're getting at sort of the struggle that so many of my guests have also talked about, which is just this implicit underlying assumption of a particular standard when it comes to how we talk about our faith, how we talk about diversity, and assuming that everyone is the same, right, when it comes to that standard. And anything that deviates from that standard then being viewed as lesser than, right? And so, yeah, I totally relate to what you shared, Helen. And also, it's powerful then to think about how do we balance that, or how do we counter that so that we can recognize the differences in God's people, but also to, like you mentioned, recognize the commonalities that hold us together, right? I think that's always a struggle, right, in my classrooms. And I think it leads me nicely into the next question, which is about an article that you wrote recently and titled Polyculturalism, Diversity Incognito, or Diversity Made Irrelevant. And in that article, you're critiquing another scholar or article that argued for the benefits of polyculturalism in organizational settings. And so let's walk through some parts of this article with the term polyculturalism. For our listeners, can you briefly define it?
Yes. Okay, so polyculturalism is in some ways an alternative, or perhaps an extension of multiculturalism from the point of view of the authors of the Focal article to which I'm responding in my commentary. So the Focal article is written by Valenzuela and Bernardo in 2023, and they suggest that polyculturalism, which is kind of an ideology around multiple cultures coexisting,
Mm.
where the emphasis is on, yes, there is kind of a recognition of the differences and we're celebrating that, but we're really emphasizing and leaning into intercultural connection
Mm.
and intercultural exposure. And so the author suggests that polyculturalism has some benefits in that it can help mitigate the intergroup conflict that can sometimes arise in multicultural contexts. So they offer polyculturalism as maybe in a moving forward from multiculturalism or the limits of multiculturalism. So that's how I would define it from the context of their article. And I think there are some positives, for sure. I think that, for one, it does emphasize and value intercultural connection. And I think that is a value that's a really important goal. I think you can have that in multiculturalism. So, but in any case, that's definitely a positive. And but I think that there are some problems with it.
Let's talk about those problems that you perceived.
Okay.
What are the critiques of
Okay.
polyculturalism? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have a few.
Yeah.
So I think polyculturalism might move us into glossing over or obfuscating our differences. So differences between groups. And sometimes we want to do this because, I mean, there can be a variety of motivations, but one, it's more comfortable in some ways to talk about how we're all similar and what we hold in common. And I do think across humanity, we have so much in common, and we should emphasize those. But if we look at outcomes or experiences of groups, we see marginalized or minority groups experiencing real disparities, right? So not everything is equal, and not all experiences are the same. And so by really focusing on what is in common, we gloss over some of those differences. And then that moves me into kind of my second critique, which is if we don't focus on disparities, we're not going to measure those disparities. So how do we know as a society if we're actually making progress on our diversity goals, for example? Because we ultimately, I mean, this is so true in organizations, we measure and we count what matters to us, what is priority. So if all of a sudden organizations are like, everybody is diverse and we want to create experiences for people to connect, that's important, but we also need to keep our eye on outcomes for groups. And so I worry a little bit that polyculturalism takes our eyes off of that. And then I also think there could be a possible dynamic where in a polycultural environment, members of minority groups or historically marginalized groups might not feel seen. They might not feel that their experiences are valid. Because even in a polycultural context, you always have a majority group. You always have a majority culture. And minority groups and minority cultures are always bumping up against that. And to some degree, adapting to that. So I want to ask, well, in what ways can the majority culture adapt to minority cultures? The onus, the burden of action seems to be a little bit on the minority cultures and groups in a polycultural framework that I find problematic.
Reminds me of, and I think you mentioned this in some ways in the article, the approach that says you acculturate to the mainstream culture by giving up your own culture, right? So when you look at the different acculturation models in multicultural psychology, one model that's problematic or potentially problematic is assimilation, where you say, okay, if you're a member of a minoritized group, the way that you succeed in this society is to become as mainstream as possible, like give up your own behaviors and values and try to look as much as the people in the dominant culture, right? And I think you can see examples of that across different types of assimilation approaches, including immigrant approaches, where immigrants, for survival reasons, maybe took on that approach of giving up their culture and trying to fit in as much as possible. So what you are saying there as a critique reminded me of that. And then also you talked about power and how that power differential is not something that polyculturalism is adequately addressing, right? That
Yes.
in an organization, in a university campus, there's going to be power differences based on social identities, and not addressing that is going to maintain that power structure. So I appreciated that point that you made as well about that.
Yeah, that's such an important point. I love the way that you just framed that.
I think you did mention this in your article about how polyculturalism also seems to imply a colorblind approach to understanding culture, or culture blind, if you will, right? That you sort of have this assumption that if you don't talk about culture, if you don't talk about disparities, right, that's what is just, that's what's fair. But then when you look at the psychological literature, a colorblind approach or culture blind approach is not truly just or truly neutral, that it always bends toward those in power. So I was reminded when you wrote this piece about the colorblind approach as well.
Yeah, there is a wonderful article written by the scholar's name is Leslie, and she actually examines different frameworks, diversity frameworks or ideologies. And so the colorblind versus the multicultural, and the colorblind was harmful. It was clearly harmful to members of minority groups.
In your bio, I read that one of your areas of interest is inclusive leadership as a solution for organizations. I love this idea. Can you share more about that and what that looks like and what it might not look like? Because I think sometimes, as we've already been talking about, that can look superficial, right? Like you can superficially apply what inclusive leadership should be. And so I'm curious if you could elaborate on what good inclusive leadership looks like.
Yes. So I will caveat this by saying that I think inclusive leadership is, or I consider it to be kind of a tent that includes multiple leadership frameworks, approaches, and behaviors. But I am kind of taking my cue from Ferdman, who lays out inclusive leadership as having some critical components. So these are critical components identified by Ferdman, which I have adopted for myself. The first is inclusive leaders strive to facilitate a culture of belonging where everyone has a sense of membership in a community. Second, they invite engagement and dialogue. Now that takes a lot of work, and it means that a leader is going to talk to lots of people at all levels of it. If I'm thinking about this from an organizational standpoint, at all levels of the organization, not just people at the top. And third, inclusive leaders model authenticity. So authenticity is really about knowing what your values are and living them out, but also being transparent with what those values are with the people that you're working with, and being okay with saying, I messed up, I made a mistake, and I want to repair that. Also, inclusive leaders are transparent in their decision making, so they will let you know what they're thinking, how decisions are being made, and hopefully there's also some collective decision making that's possible. Inclusive leaders also notice points of resistance and are willing to engage with resistance. And this also takes a lot of intention and work, because I would say a lot of leaders they have directives from their leaders and from the organization, and they're trying to move things forward. And a lot of what leaders are trying to do is they're trying to influence processes of change. And what gets in the way of change? Resistance from
Right.
individuals and groups. And so there's, businesses are trying to move so quickly and maybe intentionally or unintentionally try to like squash the resistance. Well, an inclusive leader is like, no, we need to pause and we need to pay attention to that resistance and engage with it. And sometimes resistance can, people who are resistant, they can actually become part of your coalition. If you sit and talk with them and understand their concerns, right? And see if there's a way that that they can partner in the work. And then finally, this is really important, this last piece. Inclusive leaders connect inclusion, this principal goal of inclusion, to the organization's mission and vision. So it's not that they're just doing this at a one-to-one or group level. It's that they're actually very mindful and strategic about connecting inclusion to the organization's strategy, to the mission, to the vision. That is really, really critical. So those are some of the components of inclusive leadership. And I think that you don't necessarily have to have a position of leader, a formal leadership role, to do these things.
Great point.
I mean, anybody can actually do these things. And so I think inclusive leadership kind of produces this virtuous cycle. So one person can be a catalyst for another person, and then it becomes this group level phenomenon, and then it can grow from there. So that's what I mean by virtuous cycle.
I literally was jotting down notes as you were sharing, and like you mentioned about that last point about anyone being able to do this, not those who are in formal leadership positions. I was thinking about how in the classroom too, teachers can also demonstrate this type of inclusive leadership, right? Where they're fostering belongingness, where they're showing authenticity, where they're maybe not pushing aside any resistance, but actually engaging the resistance. So I feel like all of the points that you shared are really critical for a professor who's teaching students in the classroom.
I love the fact that you just took it back to the classroom, because I have found that when students feel that they can articulate their disagreement or moments of tension or curiosity, that's it's kind of complicated. If you give them space to voice that in a kind of a safe arena, they experience greater psychological safety, and they feel empowered to actually pause, reflect, articulate, put their thought out into the ether of the classroom. And there's some really amazing things that happen in the process of having that kind of open dialogue, giving ourselves permission to talk about the tensions rather than to suppress them or to dismiss them or gloss over them. That is such, I think, a key opportunity for us as teachers in the classroom to create that kind of space.
And that's really hard work to create that kind of space, as you know, right? That in this culture of, snap sort of decisions, polarization where they're quick to put you or me like in one side of the debate, I think being able to maybe counter those tendencies and to resist those tendencies, and instead allowing people that safe space where they can share and disagree at times. I think that's really important. So thanks again for that framework. I have 3 questions that I ask all guests.
Okay.
already
Okay.
there. So I mean, I could hear you talk so much longer, Helen, but I know our time is limited. So I'm just going to go to the 3 questions that I ask all guests. The first one is about
Sure.
any research that you're doing currently that you would like to highlight. Any, what I would call the most scintillating thing about your research right now, things that you're thinking about, projects that you're working on that you would like to highlight for our listeners.
Sure. So I co-wrote a paper with a student, actually, on narrative reflexivity. It's a conceptual paper. But it's a conceptual paper that gets into the practice or praxis of narrative reflexivity. And the way that I define narrative reflexivity is that it is an examination or interrogation of the stories that we create or construct to describe or make sense of experiences. And I think human beings, just the way that we've been created, the way that we cognitively function and move through the world, we're always creating stories and telling ourselves stories, telling other people stories. And so this practice of narrative reflexivity requires people to kind of pause and think about, what is the story that I'm telling myself right now? And if I am in a group, asking what are the stories that other people are telling as well? How are these stories gelling or conflicting? Where are the bumps and collisions? And if the stories are informing how we're treating each other or decisions that we're making, then we go a little bit more into that interrogation of, are these stories serving us well? Where are they holding us back? Is it possible to co-create a new story for our group so that we can move forward? I think one place where narrative reflexivity could take place in the classroom is around, if I take this back to diversity, equity, and inclusion, is to think about what assumptions we bring into just even the concept of diversity and how we value it, why we value it, or maybe why we see some difficulties or challenges with it. So what are the stories and the assumptions built into those stories that we're telling ourselves? And can we begin to unpack them? And before we can unpack them, we have to articulate what they are. And we have to be willing to sort of dialogue with each other about those. And I think when we do this in a group, I think as individuals, we don't necessarily want to evaluate or judge other people's stories, but we're listening to those stories to reflect on them, to understand. So the goal is really, like if you and I are doing the narrative reflexivity, Paul, I would want to understand your story. And I'd want to be able to empathize with you in the telling and the experience of that story. For me, I would want the process to help me evaluate my own story in terms of seeing where it serves me or us well and where it might be hindering or where we're conflicting, if we are conflicting. So the evaluation is more on the self, the understanding is for the other. So we wrote this paper and we'll see what happens. We submitted it to a journal that's actually about exploring leadership as a practice. So thinking about leadership more in terms of what are the practices that produce change versus what do leaders do? What do they think? What are the traits that they have? It's kind of blowing up leadership thinking about it in a new way.
It's fascinating.
So that's the project that kind of has been on my mind.
As you're sharing, I kept thinking about, it's not just about telling stories, but using the stories of others to evaluate, like you said, assess my own story. And also that idea of co-creating based on other people's stories is so important in a classroom community, for example, and organizational settings as you're focusing on. This is my second question. Any advice that you might have for those who are just starting out their careers in Christian higher education or in IO psychology, and especially those who are interested in similar themes like DEI and faith integration?
Yes, I have a few things in mind. One, be willing to do the work of reading, obtaining some knowledge, listening to podcasts. There's so many podcasts around topics of DE&I, mental health, well-being, inclusion and belonging in the workplace. There are so many resources out there. So use those resources and do some reading and do some listening. And then two, start building a network. And it just starts with one conversation that can snowball into another conversation. So I always tell students, when they're having a conversation with somebody, always ask at the end, is there someone else that you think I should talk to, about my curiosity or about my interests? And oftentimes they will say, oh yeah, I think this person would be a great person for you to talk to. You can look them up on LinkedIn, or I can connect you. So you just start building a network that way through simple conversations, and have those conversations not expecting, a job, not expecting a recommendation, but really making it a curious conversation. You're having this conversation because you're curious about something, and you really love this person's perspective on it. So it's not a transactional thing.
Right.
So that's the second thing. Third, I would say get a mentor. And mentoring programs are, I don't know, they're kind of everywhere everywhere now.
Yeah.
Because we've seen the benefits of mentoring.
Right.
And so see what opportunities are available. And there's going to be something available. So make use of that. And then I would say the last thing is try new things. Start experimenting. Like, be willing to try something out and be okay with failing, because you can learn from that failure. So it's really about experimenting and adopting more of a growth mindset, sort of this learning orientation around, I'm going to try this out and I'm going to learn from the experience. My goal is not to become the best at it. My goal is not to accomplish XYZ. It is really to learn and progress as I go. So those would be some pieces of advice I'd have for people who are starting out in a particular area.
Excellent advice. Thank you. You're the second person that talked about the importance of mentoring. And so having a good mentor who can not just, again, be in a fun relationship with, but really provide that substantive mentoring. So really appreciate you highlighting that, Helen. And then my final question is, it can be a fun one or maybe a serious one, but if you could ask my next guest any question, what might it be? I don't know off the top of my head who that will be. So if you wanted to ask any question that you don't have to answer, what might it be? Yeah.
I do have a question in mind, but then I'm wondering, would you answer it?
Will I answer it? So answer it based on my own knowledge and experience?
Yeah.
I'll try. Yeah.
Okay. I don't think it's going to be too difficult.
Okay.
But I'm curious, what is the most important character attribute for you, and how does it show up in your life?
Great question. So I know this has come up quite a few times even today in our conversation. I think I've been thinking a lot about humility and what that means and what that does not mean. And for me, I think I've internalized a lot of maybe inaccurate perceptions of humility that's really based on like my Asian culture and also my Christian background in a way that sometimes gets in the way of me doing the work that I need to do. So what I mean by that is I sometimes associate humility as not speaking up, not talking about myself at all, kind of being meek and staying passive. And I'm sort of trying to fight that in a way that there's a counter narrative, a different story, if you will, about humility, which is more about serving others. It's about attitude of listening, right? But it's certainly not passive. It's super active in a way that you're always trying to understand other stories, to empathize with their experiences, and also serving others through what I do. And sometimes serving others can mean speaking up, right? And putting myself out there in a way that goes against that other narrative that I have of humility, which is just staying quiet and staying in the corner and being passive. So I say humility is something that I've been thinking a lot about and trying to change my understanding of humility. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for answering that, Paul Yost. I think would say the same thing, humility. And interestingly, Adam Grant, who's an organizational psychologist, are you familiar with him? He's just come out with a book, and it's called Hidden Potential. And his sort of thought is that humility is the key to improvement. It's this idea that we don't know it all. We're always growing and learning, and there's always the possibility of being wrong.
Right.
So he said for himself, that's been kind of the key for his life and his career.
Yeah. No, that's really powerful. That idea of, like, I have my convictions, but then I have to acknowledge that there's always the possibility that I could be off. And that applies in theology, that applies in diversity conversations. So yeah, really powerful. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will not turn it around to you because I know that's a question that you're asking my next guest or myself. So thank you so much, Helen. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up our conversation today?
I just want to say thank you for the space and the conversation. It's been very thoughtful and love your questions, and I appreciate the dialogue so much. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Cross-Cultural Psych Podcast with Dr. Paul Youngman Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you will join us next time.